Monsters, Mummies, Masked Maniacs, 32 horror movies earned $983.7 million in 2017 alone. Love 'em or hate 'em, horror movies have been a staple of American pop culture since the 1920s. But do they mean more than what we see on the surface? Could it be that in addition to demonic possession or a guy with knives for fingers, that these terrors represent our nation's greatest fears, our shame, our traumas? Our socio-political fears inspire the on-screen monsters we see. And though decade to decade the monsters may change, the fears remain relatively the same. This is my lecture on American Monsters, how horror movies reflect our country's greatest fears. Some of the reoccurring issues, and in no particular order, will come up, including communism, xenophobia, invasion, nuclear war. We're going to discuss sexism, misogyny, consumerism and excess, which we see a little bit more in the 50s and in the 1980s, breakdown of the American family, and racism. Obviously, there are a lot more movies I'd like to cover during this lecture. Unfortunately, won't be able to do that. There are many more relevant topics to this discussion, but without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. The 1920s and 1930s, the golden years of horror, the birth of modern horror as we know it, and of course the universal monsters, which we're all familiar with since childhood, Frankenstein, Dracula, the Mummy, of course. A lot of self-evident truths come to surface. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness is jeopardized by KKK, fascism, communism, and wartime. It was the silent era, and ordinary men in these movies were transformed due to an unfortunate fate. New world of monsters emerged. Again, we have Frankenstein and the rest of the gang. Legendary actor Lon Chaney and his son actually portrayed a lot of the monsters from the 1920s through the 1940s, including Frankenstein's monster, the Mummy, Count Dracula, and Lon Chaney Jr. playing the Wolfman. Monsters at this time were very basic. Fear didn't have to be represented by a complex monster with complex motives. Something could be scary in this generation as long as it was different from everything else. Here we go. This creepy guy here, Nosferatu 1922, one of the most notable entries of 20s horror movies, for making the audience actually feel anxious and uncomfortable. And it's Rotten Tomatoes' second best reviewed movie in the horror genre of all time. And here we have King Kong, a tragic love story, more than a horror movie, though those special effects were cutting edge at the time. And it was pretty creepy seeing King Kong peeking through the window in some of those original King Kong movies. Perhaps the pinnacle of the golden age of horror was when movies were made with A-list actors, directors, and producers. It was during this traumatic and embattled era that sprang American cinema's most iconic villains of the horror genre. Dracula, of course, the mummy craze, represented an America that was afraid of an unstoppable enemy. Fear of bombs, fear of attack from an outside nation, fear really of anything not white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And to briefly touch on the 1940s, definitely repression of sexuality starts to come to light through movies like The Leopard Man and Cat People. Again, love story element with the Wolfman. And due to the war times, minimalist budget because of the economy being redirected to military funds. On to the early 1950s, which some dubbed the era of the gimmick. Not a lot's really changing over the years. I mean, there are subtle nuances from movie to movie, era to era, as I guess as American issues change. Early 50s, we see the fear of bombs again, nuclear war. So with that comes a lot of the mutant monsters. We're seeing Godzilla. As war ravaged Europe and fears of nuclear fallout ran rampant, radioactive mutation became a common theme. A guy in a rubber monster suit stomping on model buildings may not terrify many modern audiences today, but when Godzilla came out in '54, it was clear and a somewhat sobering metaphor for the destruction Japan suffered after the atomic bombs that dropped at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And adding fuel to the fire, of course, was Joseph McCarthy, a senator from Wisconsin in the 1950s. That was in large part responsible for the Red Scare, America's irrational paranoia centered on the idea that evil, undermining communists were infiltrating society, posing as Americans. Massive witch hunts ensued, with numerous false accusations being made that actually ruined a lot of people's lives. And finishing up the 50s, we see a lot of profit off the fear of invasion, the blob, namely. These movies were more expensive to make, but not a financial issue in the flourishing 50s. These excessive, overly expensive productions lost steam after a while and gave way to the less expensive 60s productions. The 1960s, so now we're at a departure from the previous 3 decades, which were for the most part fun-hearted spectacles. But as the 50s came to a close, the 60s ushered in a new kind of American monster. Horror movies became more serious, more psychological, definitely more visceral. Hitchcock was a big name of the decade, where nothing was off limits, anyone can die, and protagonists were often antagonists as well. Case in point, pictured here is Janet Leigh in the movie Psycho, her iconic role where less than halfway before the end of the movie, she's killed off, which basically left it open where is this movie going to go? Women in the 1950s were shoved by society back into the home once their husbands returned from the war. And with men back to work stateside, there was excess money to spend, and conservative values were again at the front of American popular culture. I'd be remiss if I didn't briefly mention Alfred Hitchcock. He did have a reputation for treating his female stars terribly, abusing them sexually, physically, and psychologically. Actress Tippi Hedren, portrayed in the top left of the screen here, famous for her role in the 1963 Hitchcock film The Birds, said in a 2016 USA Today article, "I'll simply say that Hitchcock suddenly grabbed me and put his hands on me. It was sexual, it was perverse, and it was ugly, and I couldn't have been more shocked and repulsed. The harder I fought him, the more aggressive he became. Then he started adding threats, as if he could do anything to me that was worse than what he was already trying to do at that moment." During the second half of the 60s, the Nixon era pushes horror films to fear something greater: racism and inequality. George Romero's 1968 movie Night of the Living Dead was on the surface a zombie film, but was actually a meditation on racism and the demonization of African Americans. The fact that the lead role in Night of the Living Dead was African American but wasn't Sidney Poitier was shocking enough to moviegoers in the late 60s, let alone that the lead character ends up being the sole survivor. In the end, though, he still gets killed, which is intended to disrupt the status quo. The 1960s and 70s were among the most violent and radical decades in recent American history. Individuals leading change were assassinated, including JFK and Bobby, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X. The Vietnam War was still going on, as well as the war on racism at home, and the Watergate scandal was about to rock the nation. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre director Tobe Hooper says at the Times, "There is something cosmically wrong with life in America." Young directors, including Wes Craven and Tobe Hooper, both arguably responsible for the conception of the slasher movie a decade later, responded with shockingly blunt depictions of human cruelty. Craven with his premiere 1972's Last House on the Left, a rape revenge thriller shot with sickening home movie intimacy, and Hooper with his Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which follows members of a younger generation as they're literally led off to the slaughter. The tone of the entire genre has shifted with the times. Toward the end of the decade, up-and-coming director John Carpenter asks, what if female sexuality is punished and purity is rewarded, and creates the low-budget independent film Halloween? It breaks box office records and creates the sexist horror movie trope of the final girl, the virginal sole survivor of the slasher flick, a cliched formula that will be the blueprint for the majority of slashers in the decade to come. And here we see goodbye to the 70s and hello to the 80s. Here we see George Romero's second attempt at a zombie flick with 1978's Dawn of the Dead. We see zombies in a mall, riding escalators, it couldn't have more to say about excess and consumerism. That would be the decade to come. We have finally entered the 1980s, my personal subjective favorite, as it's my decade of birth, the age of the slasher, age of excess, consumerism, age of sequel after sequel. And the question is, are these movies misogynistic or are they just ironic? Here we see Pinhead at the bottom left from the Hellraiser series, followed by Freddy Krueger of the Nightmare on Elm Street series that spawned countless sequels, as well as Jason from Friday the 13th, and my personal favorite, Michael Myers from Halloween. These slasher movies project a certain irony, as I mentioned. Are they sexist, pro-environment, or are they simply a metaphor for Reagan and Jerry Falwell with the moral majority? After all, these movies followed formula presented by Halloween in 1978. They are cheap and badly written. The violence is questioned, although it is a very dichotomous subgenre. Okay, mid-80s, we have George Romero's third zombie movie, Day of the Dead, which tackles social and political disagreement, partisan politics of the time, of course, and the flawed humans that cannot work together. Special effects of this era reflected new technologies available to shock and scare. Namely, Tom Savini, one of the best makeup artists of the times, made sure that the scares were very realistic with the new technology coming out in the 80s. The 1990s. I'm a bit partial to this decade of horror films, although many buffs would call this decade a lull in the genre. Much like the way grunge culture rebelled against the excessive consumerism and government overreach of the 80s, this break from horror films was in response to poorly written, misogynistic slasher craze of the prior decade. In the second half of the 90s, screenwriter Kevin Williamson and director Wes Craven breathed new life into the slasher genre with Scream, creating characters that are intelligent, independent, and self-aware. It was met globally with overwhelming success, as a new audience seemed to have outgrown the modern world. I Know What You Did Last Summer and The Faculty were fabulous imitators that were also examples of the new, more self-aware teenager. The teens in these movies didn't make the same old mistakes. They made brand new ones. Quality movie making was a priority for horror film directors in the 1990s. We see the movie Seven pictured above, and below The Silence of the Lambs, which redeemed the genre's tarnished reputation, sweeping the 1992 Academy Awards and winning Oscars in the Best Actor, Best Actress, Best Director, and Best Adapted Screenplay categories. With the upcoming millennium approaching, we see the lines blur between fiction and reality. The 90s brought us the internet, reality television programming, the height of the tabloid talk show, and the 24-hour news cycle. And the line between fame and infamy, real and fake, is virtually non-existent. The new millennium greets Americans with 9/11 and the war in Iraq. And when things can't seem to get any worse, we become numb to the violence around us. Nothing shocks us anymore. In the new millennium, zombies again resurface, make a huge resurgence. Even zombie video games become movies, such as the case with Resident Evil in 2002. Then you also have I Am Legend, World War Z, and then of course you have a faster, hungrier, often satirical zombie, as is the case with Shaun of the Dead in 2004 and Zombieland in 2009. When things are heavy around you, 9/11 and things seem very serious, sometimes satire is the best way to deal with it. And when it seems things are so serious and nothing can shock you anymore, enter torture porn. The Saw movies. Violence and gore have never been so extreme as they were during the early 2000s, and henceforth since then. After 9/11 and amid the war on terror, foreign nations become depicted in horror movies as quote-unquote the other guys, and xenophobia comes back with a vengeance in Hostel. The Americans in this movie couldn't have been portrayed more like the frat boy, all-American type that other countries often find so detestable. Conversely, a more global fear community develops with the dawn of social media. We start to see movies from other countries. Haute Tension in the Center was a very scary movie from France, released with subtitles. And of course, you have the Japanese scary movies, The Ring and The Grudge. We have finally arrived at the 2010s, facing America's greatest shame and ourselves. Again, there are so many cerebral, thought-provoking horror films that came out over the last 10 years, but I'm going to focus on a few for now. I have It Follows from 2014 pictured here. For those who haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It touches upon the subject of family life, fear of aging, and of course, sexism and misogyny. Definitely, for those who haven't seen it, check it out. We arrive at 2018, Toni Collette in Hereditary. Absolutely terrifying film, and in my personal opinion, it is equally, if not scarier, than 1973's The Exorcist. It's about fear of family disconnect, family woes, similar to A Quiet Place with John Krasinski and The Babadook. The family in Hereditary suffers from communication breakdown. Do we even know our families? Division of understanding, ideologies, values. In the case of Hereditary, the message is, if we're unwilling to talk to our family about things that are hard to talk about, do we know them as well as we thought we did? And if we don't know the ones closest to us, do we know anything? With social media and technological advancement comes this familial disconnect. Quote unquote, while we think we may know people very well based on these things, it turns out that we actually may not know them as well as we hoped. While relationships in general have suffered, the biggest casualty of this societal disconnect is the concept of the family. Last but not least, we again confront race, equality, and the conservative American ideal in a way never executed before. Get Out comes out shortly after the Black Lives Matter movement and forces white America to really look. Columnist William Bibbiani writes, "It's already a point of conversation to have at a time when some claimed America was post-racial, but peel back the layers and Get Out reveals even more sharp commentary about the marginalization of non-white voices and the horror genre itself. Us, another film by Peele, released 2 years later, is a cautionary tale of society where the repressed return for revenge. The title is a double meaning, the society us and the United States us, in the centuries of economic inequality that must be righted." What's next for the future of horror? Only time can tell. But I do know this. The future of American horror will depend on two things. One, the socio-political issues that affect us, and two, and most importantly, how we choose to address them. Horror movies will always be a staple of American pop culture. But just how the monsters reveal themselves will be up to us. Thank you.